Hi, welcome to 4Score Game Reviews. This is a channel in which I plan on reviewing games based on a 4-category rubric that I developed specifically for games that rely on a sense of immersion. So that's games like RPGs and horror games, for instance. At the very end of my last video, which was a dual review for Kingdom Come Deliverance and Skyrim, I mentioned that while I'm super excited to get into Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, I didn't want to jump right into something of that size right after 100 hours with Kingdom Come Deliverance. I wanted to try my hand at reviewing something smaller and more manageable before I delve into something of that size, if for no other reason than to prevent open world fatigue. I settled on Avowed as the next game to review for this channel, because I'd read that it was more of an open zone game than an open world game, that it had a smaller and more focused story. Also, I'm a big fan of Obsidian games, so it seemed like a perfect game to use as a break from my life as a bohemian blacksmith. I knew that there was a bit of controversy surrounding the game, having something to do with tweets made by one of the creative leads, and then this whole culture war debate emerged over whether the game or its developers were woke, and frankly, I've never cared much for these types of game debates, so I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to the whole thing. I really was in the state of mind to just go in fresh, have a nice, short, enjoyable run-through of the game, and then move on to other projects. But pretty early on into that process, I ran into a problem. My early impressions of the game were fairly positive, but this faded very quickly as I started to feel like I had experienced everything that the combat system was going to show me, and especially as I started to realize that nothing about the world or its characters interested me at all. I realized by about the 12-hour mark that there was absolutely no chance that I was going to enjoy the rest of my time with the game. And this led me to a conundrum. Should I just power through it to finish the review, or should I move on to other projects that I'm more excited to work on? I did say at the end of my last video that I would review the game, but I'm a tiny, brand new channel, and to be honest, nobody is waiting to hear what I have to say to decide if they're going to play Avowed or not. The only way that a negative review can be valuable at the end of the day is either as pure consumer advocacy, steering people away from bad experiences to save them time or money, or if you can offer some kind of constructive or interesting feedback through the negativity. For instance, in my last review, while I did highlight a lot of areas in which Skyrim kind of let me down, I thought that it was worth going through that to highlight why so many of the decisions that Kingdom Come Deliverance made worked so well. I really don't want to make review videos that are purely negative, without any kind of a constructive element to them, unless by my estimation doing so is going to save people time or money, which my channel's too small to have any real chance of doing. And so I decided that reviewing Avowed just wasn't going to be worth delaying the projects that I was more excited to work on. Late at night, and after one full day with the game, I made an update post on my channel announcing to the 6 people who had subscribed to my channel, and hey, by the way, as a side note, it means the world to me that anyone found my last video interesting enough to warrant a subscription. And so from the bottom of my heart, just want to say thanks to my first batch of subscribers, who I'm gonna forever refer to as the Sexy 6. So I made this update post to my channel and I went to bed. But that night as I drifted to sleep, I was troubled. It seemed like a kind of lame cop-out to just abandon a review because I didn't like the game. I thought to myself, if I really want to do video reviews, and this is something that's gonna come up from time to time, and I can't just make it a habit of bailing out of every review where the game isn't my particular cup of tea. After all, if I want to lay praise on new games coming out that I enjoy, it'll come across as phony if I never give a negative game review. You can't just point out what you like in games, you have to be willing to talk about what you don't like. I started to try to think of ways that I could make a negative review of the game interesting or constructive, so that it would be worth all the time and effort it would take to go through the video making process. My previous game review was a double feature, and I enjoyed doing that a lot, so I told myself that I should just find a game that could be a positive counterexample to Avowed. I said to myself, if you thought that that world was sterile and uninteresting, pick a game as a counterexample with a world that's anything but, and talk about what was so special about it. And ideally, you should pick one with some convenient and topical connection to Avowed, like, I don't know, haven't been made by the same developer. And I started to have memories flash into my mind of this game that I had played. One that had this absolutely fascinating setting with these deep, interesting characters. It was this game world that I had constantly gone back to over the last 15 years, because it just felt like every time I went back, I saw a different side of it than I'd ever seen before, because of how unique every playthrough of that game felt. And suddenly, a vision started to come to me for a different type of a review than I had previously planned. One that would include far more references to the American pop culture of the 1950s. Yes, the review has to be constructive. The answer was right in front of me this whole time. The answer always was big iron. Big iron. Big iron. And so that's what we're doing for this review. Get your cowboy hats, dust off the Geiger counters. It's time for some New Vegas, baby. I was going to review this game within my first year as a reviewer, so I figured why not just take this excuse to bump it up a bit in the queue. And to save us some runtime, I'm not going to waste any time in this video explaining the thought process behind my review categories. I will at some point in the future make a proper channel introduction video that'll explain what every category means and how they're scored. But until that time, if you want to know more about my scoring categories, you can check out the introduction of my very first upload. Let's jump right into category 1, Strength of Illusion. In this category, I'm going to compare techniques that both of the games use to create a world that's believable at a surface level. This includes graphics, art style, writing, world design, you name it. We're looking at what tricks these games use to convince you that you've dropped into another world that aren't related to gameplay. Here's the question that I want to answer in this section of the review. How is it possible that a game made by 65 people for a budget of about $30 million could provide a significantly more compelling surface-level illusion than a game that was made by the same developer 15 years later with 3 to 5 times the budget? Well, it's not going to shock you to hear that in some areas, Avowed absolutely blows New Vegas out of the water in this category. In terms of visual presentation, for instance, New Vegas wasn't even really considered a looker at the time it was released, but Avowed is a beautiful game by today's standards. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can really see where the extra budget and resources went to with Avowed. It looks like $1 million. And I'll talk about this in depth in just a bit, but to me the biggest and the most interesting comparison to make between these two games in this category is the way that they were both written. See, any game's visual elements are an undeniably important part of its surface level appeal, but they're only part of it. If the world isn't crafted in a way that intrigues you or that makes you want to learn more about it, then no amount of ray tracing or fancy water effects is going to make you feel like you've entered another reality, no matter how gorgeous the image on your monitor is. I need to make a ham-fisted segue here, and I promise that it's going to be the only one for the entire video. The YouTube channel Red Letter Media has this great series of reviews for the Star Wars prequels. They're serious YouTube classics. If you haven't seen them, I highly recommend at least watching their review of Episode 1. There's really just fascinating breakdown of the movies that are very insightful, and I think you'll enjoy them. So here's a point that they brought up very early in that review and that they reinforced throughout it. When you're asking audiences to get invested in some fantasy reality that's nothing like the world that they live in, you need to sort of throw them a bone. If you're asking them to step into a world where there are bizarre-looking aliens flying around in weird spaceships to fight wars with robots and clone soldiers, and there's a really complicated backstory to how the space government works and who's in charge of it, you can't just beat them over the head with all of this at once. You have to drip feed it to them while presenting them with things that they can relate to along the way, or else the world will very quickly start to feel weird and boring. The original Star Wars film from 1977 eased the audience into the world in 2 ways. First of all, it introduces you to the setting in a way that gradually expands. It doesn't try to cram the entire backstory of the universe down your throat through expositional dialogue in the first 10 minutes of the movie. It starts you off by telling you that there's an evil, powerful space empire that's pursuing a group of rebels. Then it introduces you to a relatable character who has understandable goals and motives, who will be your guide through the rest of the film. The fact that we have Luke Skywalker to follow throughout this movie is really what makes it work. If you didn't have the perspective of this young, naive Optimus as the central one, the movie wouldn't be a fun, action-filled adventure. It would be a boring, confusing mess of trying to figure out why these two weirdos are hitting each other with laser swords. It also helps that along the way you meet other awesome characters who, like Luke, have understandable human motivations for what they're doing. These characters give you a reason to stick around in the theater long enough to learn the names of all the planets and the alien races. Without them, nobody would really care what a Wookiee is or how fast the Millennium Falcon did the Kessel Run. It's because of them that this journey as a whole has meaning. You get to root for these characters as they grow, learn, change, and by the end of the journey become different people than they were at the start. And this is the mistake that the Star Wars prequels and Avowed make. They assume that the people liked Luke Skywalker and Han Solo because they existed in a world with cool laser swords and fast spaceships. What they don't realize is that Luke and Han were the point. They were the reason that we cared about everything else. So the Star Wars prequels just bash you over the head with this long, confusing story about a blockade of space trade and a senator with a secret plan to invade a planet of fish people with robots. And then these emotionally muted warrior monk dudes who have to travel to all these different planets with hard to pronounce names to find out what they're doing and fight the bad guys whose motives that you don't really understand. The prequel trilogy is made by supposedly the same team of creatives as the original, or largely the same team anyways, about 15 years later, with way more money and resources than the original movies were made with. And they look way more expensive, but there's just something off about them. They just don't feel as though they could have possibly come from the same creative team that made the original movies. For all the flash and dazzle of the lightsaber fights in the prequels, they're nowhere near as impactful or memorable as the ones in the original trilogy, because they lack a human element. Somehow, all of that money and bloated CGI budget didn't suck us into the experience as much as these two guys in movie prop costumes swinging colored rods at each other. Is the parallel that I'm trying to draw here starting to get overly obvious at this point? Yeah, I thought so too, so let's move on to talking about the writing of New Vegas. The game introduces you to the setting in a way that mirrors the start of the first Star Wars movie. You're told that humanity was wiped out in nuclear war, but that some people have survived in underground vaults. In the time since people emerged from the vaults to reoccupy the wasteland, new societies have formed, and factions have emerged that are fighting each other for power. In the American Southwest, the central conflict is between the New California Republic, or NCR, sort of an attempt at recreating the liberal democracies of the world before the war, and Caesar's Legion, a throwback to the Roman Empire that relies on brutality and slave labor to fuel their expansion. There's also a mysterious tycoon figure who runs the New Vegas Strip, who nobody knows a whole lot about. So you're starting this journey knowing that there are 3 key players in the world to be aware of. And then the game gives you a personal hook. It tells you that you, the player, have been tasked with delivering a package, and then it has a jerk in a checkered jacket steal this package from you and shoot you in the head. So you're starting this game off with a very simple, clear picture of what's happening in the world and a personal investment in pursuing a line of investigation. You have a personal investment in finding out what the package you were carrying was and in finding the asshole who shot you. You awaken in the town of Good Springs, which you learn is an independent settlement that's doing its best to stay out of the conflict that you learned about in the intro. You learn there that some of the people in town don't view the NCR particularly favorably, but that they view them as by far the lesser of 2 evils compared to the Legion. So your mental picture of both the NCR and the Legion start to kind of fill in a little bit. You realize that NCR membership carries with it both the benefits and the drawbacks of a centralized political authority, and you realize that the Legion is probably more brutal and extreme than you originally thought. You also realize that there's something weird about this robot character that dug you out of the ground. Nobody in town seems to know very much about him or why he hangs around town, but he does seem to have a very specific interest in you, and you keep bumping into him as you travel. Also in your travels, you start to encounter additional factions outside of the ones in the original cutscene, and you can take sides with or against them. The game sort of guides you along a very specific path to reach the Vegas Strip, in which time you'll meet representatives of a lot of the important factions in the game and get a sense of how they operate and who they're in conflict with. You meet lots of interesting people who have unique perspectives based on their backgrounds, and who have relatable human motivations, who just draw you into the setting even further. These people all feel very unique, and like their perspective, outlook, and allegiances are a result of their circumstances and history. What you might call the conclusion of the first act of the game is when you finally arrive to the New Vegas Strip and are invited to enter the Lucky 38 casino to meet Mr. House. At this point, you've personally encountered all of the main factions and most of the important side factions, and you probably have a pretty good sense of who, if anyone, you're interested in siding with. It sets you up pretty perfectly for the start of the second act, where you're going to start to play an active role in shaping who's going to come out on top in the central power struggle of the game. I was absolutely sucked into the game at this point, and this is just as true during my first playthrough as it's been during my numerous subsequent playthroughs. Now I want to shift gears. I want to show you where I was at sort of the equivalent story point in Avowed.
How about we start with Marius at the Grinning Balrog? Besides, I could use a drink after all this.
I have never cared less about the story of an RPG. Like, it's no exaggeration to say, like, you could not make me give less of a shit than I currently give about who these people are or what this world is.
And so you might ask, why did I feel this way? What was so different in Avowed's execution of the story and setting? Well, I gotta be honest with you, it didn't start out this way. My first impressions of the game were fairly positive. The basic premise that the opening cutscene sets you up with is simple enough. There's a big kingdom that's having some internal political problems, so you're sent as a representative of that kingdom to an outlying island territory that's sort of wild and unsettled. Your interest is basically to see if you can have a shot at a do-over for the kingdom in this new land. The only real problem is that there's some magical mushroom plague that's affecting the island, and in order to do what the king wants you to do, you have to de-shroomify the island first. I honestly got serious Morrowind vibes, and that's by far my favorite Elder Scrolls game. What's more, I was seriously blown away by the visual presentation when the game started. But here's where the problems that I ended up having with the game first started to present themselves. I got through the tutorial area and I was immediately giddy to go forth and meet people and see what schemes or adventures I could involve myself in. So here was my first dialogue sequence after arriving in the first city of the game. I find out that I'm the envoy, and that in order to go forward with my mission, I need to find the ambassador, who has some relationship with somebody called the Clavager. Someone standing on the dock, who I learn is a Rawatayan, recommends that we team up because he needs to find the Clavager and I need to find the ambassador. And they should both be together for reasons that I'm sure somebody probably explained. So my journey starting off was something along the lines of, go with the Rawatayan to the Strangle route past the Pargrin wall to find the ambassador and the Clavager. Okay, I mean, this isn't bad. I mean, I preferred find the guy who shot you in the head, but this is an okay starting point. So I walk into town a bit and I find a woman who needs help with something. She needs to find a watcher for something that has to do with the house. My character for some reason knows what a watcher means. Apparently it's somebody who can read souls, but I have no idea what reading a soul means in this context. She then says that she's having problems with Zarips at her house, and while I think this is related to her need for a soul reader, I can't really be sure because I don't have any idea what a Zarip is. So I go to her house and I deal with the Zarips, which it turns out are weird lizard things, and I find a drawing on the wall showing an elf woman holding hands with Zarips, as well as a journal entry that suggests that the elf woman who gave me this quest was having dreams about Zarips. I have no idea if this means anything in particular because I don't know how elves work in this universe, and also I learned what a Zarip is 30 seconds ago when I killed one for the first time. But I head back to the woman, and after telling her that I read her diary, she tells me that an animancer, which is another new noun, told her that she might have half a soul, and that the other half of it is probably with some other being. I'm taking this as meaning that she possibly thought that a Zarip was her soulmate, but then again she just asked me to kill the ones in her house, and I did. So I really have no idea what I just did for her or what her situation is. But from there I set off into the world to do some adventuring, and I was just blown away by the visuals of the environments that I explored. But I, at the same time, couldn't help but notice that all the people that I talked to and all the books and notes that I found were just dumping nouns on me that I'd never heard before. And at this point I was starting to feel like I feel when I watch the Star Wars prequels. I'm just drowning in unfamiliar nouns that I have zero connection with or interest in. Like maybe somewhere there's someone trying to blackmail someone because they found out they'd done something shady in their past. I don't know, I mean, I'm just drowning in unfamiliar nouns at this point, and this green rock keeps telling me a bunch of really weird stuff that I don't understand, and sometimes it talks to me when I'm sleeping. And I mean, I'm really, at this point, feeling like I'm overdue to meet Han Solo in the cantina. But the problem is that every character I meet ends up feeling like Jar Jar Binks.
Now, we must consider this.
Alright, what the fuck just happened? What is this?
I go to try to find the ambassador, but he's just as weird as everybody else, and he starts to tell me that the Outtro, which I think is the green rock, is filled with something called essence, which maybe means that it's connected to the mushrooms. He advises me to go and touch the big green rock, because my special Shroomborn powers might give me some special ability to talk to it, and unfortunately he's right, because the second I put my hands on it, it started to say a bunch of just weird shit. The joy of just exploring the world and finding all the little hidden trinkets tucked away, fighting enemies and all of that was enough motivation for me to keep following quest markers in quests. but I had absolutely no idea at this point in the story what I was doing or who I was supposed to find or any of that. And the longer I went without any character having any interesting problem, without meeting someone who seemingly had a reason to exist aside from dumping new nouns on me, it led me to a point pretty early in the game where I just gave up on trying to understand the world at all. You see these people standing over here by this boat? I wonder if they're trying to smuggle something illegal on that boat. Let's go talk to them and find out. Okay, so the Outtro channels essence, and it could also teach us about the Dream Scourge. Got it. Okay, and with enough essence and an animancer, I can trace the tether. Okay, so you people just want to talk about the lore. Got it. How about this guy over here? What does he have to say? Okay, a bandit stole the reliquary of Saint Weldwin. The war is ended and the scar remains. Maybe the gods have abandoned the... Fuck.
Just want you to stop saying odd shit, like you smell a psychosphere or you're in someone's faded memory of a town. Just stop.
Look, I tried to find a reason to care about this world, but everything in it just felt so artificial. The people in it seemed like they were only there to give me boring, follow the quest marker to find my missing nouns type of quests, or to dump lore on you. And the cities that you visit just have this bizarre, empty feeling to them. Not that they don't have people in them, just that they have this uncanny valley lifelessness to them, sort of in the way that cities in MMOs always feel fake and empty without other players to fill them up. The life that is present in cities just feels sort of off. It's extremely weird that nobody's bothered by my stealing their stuff right in front of them. Nobody really goes anywhere or does anything in the cities. And I mean, look, I could overlook all of this if there was one person or note or book in the game that stood out as anything other than just a spigot for Obsidian to use to hose me down with lore.
The Kerfampafam in Reseteris had a great Palantine. The Jeerwood Admith said the 10-year treatise ended the slavery, and Aldmith Hadrit replaced him. And Jesus. Holy fucking shit. Noun.
I worry that the impression that's going to start to come across is that I just don't enjoy learning about the worlds of RPGs, or that I don't like having to pay attention in dialogue. But the thing is that the Fallout universe has an incredibly rich and dense backstory, and you can spend hours and hours in that game just listening to characters talk about the world or reading terminal logs to piece it all together. The critical difference between the way that the two games handle their world exposition is that in New Vegas, the world feels like it's full of people, real flesh and blood human beings, and the story feels like it's the result of the actions of these people. It doesn't feel as though the story is something that the characters in the world exist to tell you about. Here's a great example of this. This is Boone. He's one of the two snipers who watches over the town of Novak to keep it safe from raiders and legionaries. You'll more than likely meet him pretty early in the game. Boone has a story. For one, he's a former NCR 1st Recon sniper. He joined the NCR with Manny Vargas, the other Novak sniper, who at the time was his best friend. There's a whole story to how they fell out. There's also a story behind why Boone decided to leave the NCR, having to do with his having been involved in an infamous battle between the NCR and the Great Khans. It's a pretty sad story. But Boone doesn't want to tell you about any of this when you meet him. You see, Boone's wife was kidnapped by Caesar's Legion. He seems pretty convinced that she's dead, like really, really convinced that she's dead. And again, there's a story behind this. But the thing is that Boone doesn't exist to tell you stories. He has his own goals and motives. What he wants to talk to you about, in fact the only thing that he will talk to you about when you meet him, is that he's pretty convinced somebody in Novak coordinated with the Legion to help them kidnap his wife. Boone wants revenge. That's it. That's all he cares about. If you try to get him talking about anything else aside from that, he'll give you one-word answers or just flat-out refuse to talk on certain subjects. You have the option to help him identify the person in town who aided the Legion in the kidnapping, and you can assist him in exacting his revenge. After this, he no longer has any ties to Novak, and he's recruitable as a follower. But still, he doesn't turn into an exposition hose. He still doesn't really want to talk about his past at all. He'll only open up to you with additional dialogue after you spend a lot of time with him, and only if the actions that you take in his company are compatible with his values, which basically boils down to killing legionaries. And he never fully opens up to you. There are things about him and his perspective that you'll only learn in the event of his death if you check the holotape that he carries. The reason that I cared about the world of New Vegas and its dense and tangled history is that I got to piece it together bit by talking to people like Boone. There's a storyline in the game in which you meet a robot named Yes Man. He's a Securitron robot that was specifically programmed for maximum compliance, hence his name. Yes Man will absolutely dump every detail that he's ever learned about the world on you if you ask him to, and he'll even comment that it probably wasn't very smart of his designer to program him to be this unconditionally cooperative.
I was programmed to be helpful and answer any questions I was asked. I guess nobody bothered to restrict who I answer questions for. That was probably pretty dumb, huh?
The whole situation is very clearly played as a joke. The game expects that you're gonna find this character amusing. But a joke like this carries an implication to it. A joke like this doesn't work in a world where information is cheap and everybody that you meet just bombards you with whatever information you want to know. Take Mr. House as an example. When he invites you to join him in the Lucky 38 penthouse, he's doing it because he sees you as a means to an end. Rest assured, House knows everything that there is to know about New Vegas and its faction. The guy's over 200 years old and he's been running the Vegas Strip for the last 7 years through his army of Securitrons. There's nothing you could possibly want to know about the state of things in New Vegas that he couldn't tell you everything about. And yet, in his interactions with you, he's very slippery. He clearly wants to tell you as little as he can get away with telling you. He'll flat out refuse to tell you about a lot of things, and on other topics you can tell that he's not really giving his full perspectives. House doesn't exist to serve you as the player. He has his own goals and he'll only tell you what you need to know in order to help him get what he wants. If you want to learn more about him, your best bet is frankly to just go explore the world and talk to people. Not everyone that you'll meet is going to know a lot about him, but you can piece together a fairly complex picture of the man and his backstory just by exploring New Vegas. While exploring North Vegas, for instance, you'll learn that there's a tool company that the local salvagers are too afraid to enter because its former occupants rigged it with lots and lots of booby traps, and every scavenger who's ever entered the place hasn't come back. You'll learn a good deal about Mr. House if you choose to investigate this place, if you can sort of read between the lines of the communication logs that you find and put some basic clues together. I absolutely love this quality of New Vegas. The backstory of the world is dense and fascinating, but at the end of the day, the people that you meet are only going to be able to tell you about the part of it that they've seen, and they can only tell you the story from their perspective. When you talk to the residents of Good Springs at the start of the game, aside from some very basic info about the war between the NCR and the Legion, mostly what they can tell you about is Good Springs itself and the area immediately around it. The tasks that they'll ask you for help with are simple ones. They're having problems with the local gang, and they need assistance clearing critters away from their water source. These are people who are just trying to get by and preserve their independence and security. If you talk to the NCR soldiers guarding the sharecropper farms outside of the Strip, they can tell you a bit about the farms themselves. They can describe the area immediately surrounding the farms. They know a little bit about the conflict with the Legion, and they can clue you in on potential work in the area that is specifically related to problems that the NCR is having with local raiders. The King, as a major political player in the neighborhood of Freeside, can tell you about Freeside and its history, and the work that he gives you has to do with solving problems that his gang is encountering in that neighborhood. This NCR soldier looking at the memorial to the Battle of Hoover Dam, he can tell you about that battle, and he can also tell you a little bit about what his role is in the NCR. This charming young fellow here with bloodshot eyes and dirt all over his face, who's leaning against a bombed-out building in a gang-infested part of town, wants to talk to you about Plato's allegory of the cave and whether it's best interpreted through an epistemological lens or a political "I'm just fucking with you," he wants to sell you drugs. The fact that most people in the world are just sort of going about their personal business and don't have much concern for what's happening outside of their own little domains just makes New Vegas feel like an actual place. And on top of that, it really makes the characters who can give you a significant amount of information stand out as special. Chief Hanlon is the leader of the NCR Rangers. He's been fighting for the NCR for 40 years. He was the head of the Rangers during the first Battle of Hoover Dam, and he's sort of seen it all. And he's now reflecting on his long life of service, wondering whether he was able to do any good. He will dump world exposition on you, especially regarding the NCR and the Legion. But the thing is that I eagerly listened to every word that he had to say, because it's so rare to find somebody like him who both knows a lot and is willing to share that information with you. Similarly, Joshua Graham, the war chief of the Dead Horses tribe in Zion Canyon, is doing his best to live a life of quiet atonement for his role in creating Caesar's Legion more than 30 years ago. He can give you a perspective on the Legion, and Caesar in particular, that nobody else in the game can. New Vegas players found this character so compelling that a whole genre of YouTube videos now exist where this character reads you famous public domain books through the power of AI. The other thing that's great about how believable and well thought out the characters in New Vegas are is that they make the oddball ones really stand out. Just have a look at some of the lovable misfits that I encountered in my most recent playthrough.
God, but are you ugly? Get upstairs and talk to Jason before I throw up just from looking at you. Your pranks won't work on me, Smooth Skin. They won't work on Jason either.
What's that, Antler? We have a visitor. An assassin, more like. I say kill it, Antler, for safety. Who is Antler? Who is Antler? Antler, the human asks about you.
So this guy, Nobart, in this setting where people are basically just trying to establish community and survive, he stands out as an eccentric. He's for sure the black sheep of his community, and he probably doesn't get invited to a lot of social outings. But if you drop him into any city in Avowed, he would fit right in. They would probably think he was some square. They'd be like, bro, do you even soulbond Zorips? Hell, these freaks would probably end up electing him their mayor within a week. And while we're on the topic of Avowed, let me sing it the praise that it is due. It's an unbelievably good-looking game. It has some of the best use of lighting that I've ever seen in a game. The ray trace reflections are gorgeous, and on top of that, there's a huge degree of visual variety. You'll see a lot of mushroom-infested forests throughout the runtime of the game, but you'll also encounter lots of beautiful cave environments, some desert scenery, and there's a pretty cool area towards the end of the game that has serious Mordor vibes. I was never hurting for eye candy to gawk at in my playthrough of the game. The only thing that I would say about the presentation of the game that isn't totally positive is that after a certain while, it does start to feel a little samey and one note. I think the art style of the game could best be described as, yo dog, I heard you like mushrooms. And I get that it makes sense from a narrative standpoint because the mushroom plague is the central sort of driving force of the story. But after a certain point, if I'm honest, the art style of the game really started to feel samey. Also, a lot of the sort of fantastical elements of the world started to seem a little like bizarre for bizarre's sake. Like, look at these farm animals as an example. They're sort of like zebra, tapir, parrot cows. And it just screams to me of something that an AI art generator could have made after like 30 iterations of prompts like hybrid fantasy farm animal. They also look just a little out of place next to, pigs and chickens. So to give Avowed a score in this category, I'm just going to summarize as follows. For the most part, it nails the look of the world, but that's the only place that it succeeds. The world itself isn't really believable or interesting, and I never cared about it in the slightest. Avowed's surface level appeal is purely a function of its art style, its graphics, and especially its lighting. It completely fails to suck you into the world by any other means. New Vegas is a near complete inversion of this. It has only the most basic visual tricks to help it sell its world, and for the most part it's entirely dependent upon its writing and how well constructed the world is. It does have a good amount of visual variety. The Mojave Desert looks nothing like Freeside, casinos in Freeside look grungy and dilapidated compared to the opulence of the Strip casinos. The mountainous region in the northwest, Red Rock Canyon and Zion Canyon show you a little bit of geological variety, but let's be honest here, the visuals of the game are very basic and in a lot of cases are jarringly ugly. New Vegas's surface level appeal is entirely a function of how believable it is as a place, and how real the people in it feel. I mentioned earlier that Avowed's world feels strangely empty and lifeless, even in cities. In New Vegas, there's just always interesting encounters happening, even out in the empty desert. In the actual city, there's this feeling of life, of people going about their business.
Look at him go. Remember when all you needed to have fun was a kitchen knife and a giant rat? God, to go back, right? You know what I'm talking about?
The world also stands up to scrutiny to a ridiculous degree. For instance, all the settlements either have the means of producing their own food and water, or they're very clearly structured in a way to attract and defend trade caravans. When you find the Brotherhood of Steel in Hidden Valley, you notice that there are these huge fans protruding out of the ground. And you can learn through reading data terminals that this is part of their strategy for remaining untargetable by automated weapons systems. They've infused the soil around their base with aluminum and various silicates so that the fans create a dust cloud that scrambles radar signals. The boomers, when they succeed in raising a B-29 out of Lake Mead, explain that in order to get the plane back to their base for repairs, they're going to launch a series of decoy artillery attacks in the area to draw attention away from Lake Mead. Someone at Obsidian really sat down and thought through how to make New Vegas seem like a real place, and all of that effort paid serious dividends. These are the moments in my playthroughs where I felt the most strongly under the surface level spell of each game. In Avowed, it was this scene right here. Look at those real-time mushroom reflections. I mean, aren't they just beautiful? And isn't the whole scene just beautifully lit? Now for New Vegas. I was wearing some NCR faction armor that I had in my inventory purely because it was the armor in my inventory with the highest defense. I walked into a bar near a small NCR base, and the barkeeper commented that it was weird to see me in there since NCR soldiers are banned from entering the bar. I even had the dialogue option to tell him that I wasn't in the NCR and just happened to be wearing the armor. And here's the thing, 99% of the characters that you're going to meet in the world won't comment on your outfit at all, but what wowed me in this moment was that it made perfect sense that this specific character would in this situation. This bar is near a military base, and it makes sense that soldiers would be banned from going to the bar in uniform. It therefore makes sense that this character would find my entering his establishment in an NCR outfit unusual. New Vegas is an old-looking game that didn't look great when it was new, and at times it looks distractingly bad. But it still puts you under this unbelievably powerful illusion that you've entered another world, just because of how well written the world is and how carefully thought out all of the elements in it are. Avowed will get a 4 out of 10 in this category, and New Vegas will get an 8 out of 10. Now, I'm not going to make a habit of doing this for my reviews, but in this particular case, I had more to say in this category than I have for the rest of both games combined. This one category is where a huge majority of my time thinking and writing about the game went, and it just made sense to me to make this part 1 of a 2-part video review. This is partly just for the viewing experience, as some people might care more about this part of the review than the second part, or vice versa. But also, since this part of the review is where a huge majority of my thinking and time went, I kind of want it to be able to stand on its own as its own sort of commentary on how you should and shouldn't go about creating a compelling RPG world. Part 2 is mostly written, and it's not going to take nearly as long to produce as Part 1 did. I'll then be left with one video, which I'm really hoping is going to be a shorter one, that I want to finish before I start on Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I'm really just counting the seconds until I can start playing that game, but I have to do this other review first. Long story short, it times with the 20-year anniversary of one of my absolute favorite games of all time, so I'm just going to finish that review before I jump back in with Henry. I'll see you all fairly shortly with part 2 of this review, and as always, thank you very much for watching if you made it all the way through. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate you watching.
My men new orders
Zip it
without
for a
telling
minute.
me,
Can you, hey, hold on.
breaking the chain
Hey, hold on though.
binds.
Big Iron is on.
With this, I can finally have him
Big
removed
Iron,
as
excuse
elder
me.
and end this ridiculous
Excuse me.
lockdown.
How dare you talk through Big Iron? It was early in the morning.